Well, good evening. I hope you enjoyed last week's lecture. We started the reproductive system with male. Tonight we'll be doing the reproductive system with female, chapter 22 from Holes. So as we progress through the PowerPoint, what will happen is I'll be speaking and highlighting certain information on some of those slides. And then as you're working, feel free to update some of the questions on the website, and then we can submit that as a worksheet onto Blackboard. So let's get started. So as we start the female reproductive system anatomy this evening, we'll start with the uterus. Okay, that large, smooth muscular organ located within the parietal peritoneum. Notice the entrance to the uterus, what we refer to as the cervix. Let's see here. And fornices sort of border the lateral edges of the cervix, leading to the vagina and the reproductive canal. Also note that the excretory pathway, the urethra, is anterior to the reproductive passageway here. Superior to the uterus, we have the oviducts, or uterine tubes, with the fimbriae attached. Now notice the ovary sits nested within the uterine tube. Those fimbriae are these finger-like extensions that will capture the egg released from the ovary due to ovulation, and sort of pick those up and gently guide those into the uterine tube along its way to the uterus. You can see in this cross-section the general arrangement and layout of the organs. We mentioned the bladder being sort of anterior to the uterus, with the rectum remaining posterior, and lastly the coccyx of the spine, and some of the other organs in that general area. The ovaries on the right and left side of the abdominal cavity, much like the testes we had mentioned last week, end up sort of moving through this section of development posterior to the parietal peritoneum, and are bound by this membrane connective tissue. We see here the suspensory ligament of the ovary, the fimbriae, like we had mentioned, that guide the movement of the egg through the ovarian tube, the ovarian ligament in front, and obviously, or anterior, and the round ligament of the uterus, really suspending the uterus to basically grow and accompany the change in size of the fetus as it grows. Oftentimes can produce quite a bit of discomfort for females due to the pressure and the increasing size of the embryo and the fetus in the uterus, along with that connective tissue. On the right side of that diagram, you see an additional layer of connective tissue, the broad ligament, which inserts on the wall of the ilium of the pelvis, again, just maintaining some of those tissues. As we take a look at the structure of the ovary, some of the germinal cells that produce the gametes during meiosis are found in the ovary. These cells are produced by meiosis. They have half the genetic material that normal body cells do, with 23 chromosomes. You can see here we have the whole spectrum, starting with the primordial follicles, from the outer layer, the cortical regions of the ovary, and those are matured and stimulated for development through a variety of hormones, which we'll get into a little bit later. And as those continue to mature, eventually leading to what we call a mature oocyte. And you can see here on the left side of the diagram, let's see if I can draw an arrow there, pointing to the mature oocyte with the follicle around there, the cells and tissues that are around the outside we call follicular cells, and producing this fluid in an open space called the antrum, located in that surrounding region there. Within the ovary, guided again by the development of hormones, each of those primordial follicles are stimulated for development with an egg cell. Most of those egg cells were actually produced prenatally. I think females are born with upwards of 250,000 viable egg cells, but only one matures at a time. And we know that through puberty, that process that stimulates meiosis. And you see here in the flow chart, we have the primary oocyte with 46 chromosomes, contributions from both parents, and the primary oocyte will go through the first division of meiosis. Within the first division of meiosis, we have a reduction in the number of chromosomes going from 46, 23 pairs, to 23 chromosomes, each with 2 chromatids, and forming what we call a secondary oocyte. Unlike we learned last week with sperm formation, with oogenesis, there's an unequal division, cytokinesis, if you will, of the cytoplasm. You can see first the secondary oocyte on the top, and the other one below, referred to as a polar body. And you can see that there's quite an unequal separation of cytoplasm, along with all the cytoplasmic organelles. Now, as this egg cell is going through maturation, you'll notice down below that the secondary oocyte will basically maintain a state of dormancy. Here you see down in the micrograph below that secondary oocyte along with the polar body, that small arrow that's pointing there. And we'll just maintain the state of dormancy until fertilization occurs, bringing with it another set of 23 chromosomes. Immediately following that, the cell will go through meiosis II, which is the second meiotic division, again spilling out additional polar body here and forming a zygote here. And that zygote now has, again, the full complement diploid, 46 chromosomes, 23 from the sperm and 23 from the egg, and becomes a viable organism. One of the interesting pieces of information that we can look at by studying this process is the idea of a polar body biopsy. Oftentimes we can look and see if any of those chromosomes contain deleterious genes. And if they do, and we watch the formation of that polar body, we know that there's a separation, 23 chromosomes, each with 2 chromatids making their way to the secondary oocyte, and the remaining moving to the polar body. If we look at those polar bodies, and we find that those deleterious chromosomes are found in the polar body, we know that it does not exist in the mature secondary oocyte, and so that oocyte is going to be viable and free of any genetic disease. So, and the polar bodies, as you know, are simply discarded and reabsorbed by the cells and tissues of the body. On the left hand of the slide, we have our primordial follicles. Let's see if I can draw another arrow here. Along the cortical regions, towards the medulla of the ovary, we see a mature oocyte being generated, and we have this cartoon sort of micrograph here with the follicular fluid, along with the corona radiata. These are sometimes referred to as nurse cells that surround the outside of the mature the follicle. In addition, we see the small layer, this protein layer called the zona pellucida, which provides a layer of protection for that mature follicle, and as we'll see later during early development, provides another unique feature. So the secondary oocyte is primed and ready to be released. We just need the interventions of some hormones. This micrograph is trying to demonstrate sort of this continual process of maturation of these secondary oocytes, starting with the germinal epithelial cells, moving into some of the primordial follicles here, each one stimulated through a process, forming a mature follicle with the follicular fluid. After the release of the secondary oocyte, we can see a degenerating follicle here that will become, you can see here, the follicular scar or corpus albicans, and will turn into another structure called the corpus luteum. That corpus luteum is responsible for producing, again, some additional sex hormones. The cortical regions of the ovary, under the presence of FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone, and also luteinizing hormone, will cause a rupture of that membrane, releasing that oocyte, and we're being ready to be captured by the uterine tube, the fimbriae. Here's a cartoon version trying to demonstrate that same process, looking at the primordial follicles and the process of maturation, producing those follicular cells, the follicular fluid, release of the secondary oocyte. And this secondary oocyte is covered by a layer of radiaceous cells, the nurse cells, along with the zona pellucida. Notice the first polar body still traveling there has not gone through meiosis II, simply because we are waiting on fertilization. This secondary oocyte gets picked up by the fimbriae into the uterine tube post-ovulation, and those muscular contractions along with cilia that line the uterine tube will slowly pull that secondary oocyte into the canal. On this slide, we continue with the reproductive anatomy. Uterine tubes are sometimes referred to as oviducts. With the fimbriae do attach to the uterine tubes and guide or pick up the movement of that secondary oocyte from the ovary into the uterine tube. Lined with ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue, it helps guide that egg as the sperm is making its way up through the uterine tube, through the uterus and the vagina. For this section here, we see the secondary oocyte down here getting picked up by the fimbriae and what they refer to as the infundibulum of the uterine tube. Highly vascular. That ovary is suspended by that connective tissue called a broad ligament. Round ligament on the other side here, you can see, is going to suspend the uterus to support and encourage development of the fetus as that goes through the early stages and late stages of development. As we discussed last night, as that secondary oocyte is making its way through, it has undergone meiosis I, but will not go through meiosis II until fertilization is complete. Sperm are making their way up the reproductive tract through the uterus and into the oviducts. And once that sperm couples with the egg following fertilization, we create the zygote, and then the secondary oocyte will go through or finish meiosis II, kicking out another polar body. Like we mentioned previously, the lining tissue of the uterine tubes contains the pseudostratified, ciliated, pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue, and those cilia help to move and guide that egg through the uterine tube as it's making its way to the uterus. The uterine wall consists of 3 layers, much like we've seen with other muscular tissues. Endometrium contains a mucosal layer and some columnar epithelial cells, which produce glands, some mucus. Myometrium, which is the muscular portion of that, and the perimetrium, that serous layer. On an interesting side note, the endometrium is typically what we think of as forming this chorionic villi structure that we'll see later in development that becomes part of the placenta. Evidently, the perimetrium can also take over that function. There's been a case where a rogue secondary oocyte made its way around the reproductive tract, but not inside, attached to the perimetrium on the outside, and there formed the placenta. Obviously, normal vaginal birth would not be possible there, but through C-section, they're able to open and remove, during the 9th month, and end up having a very healthy baby girl. This slide has an overview of the uterus. We just were looking at those 3 layers of tissue: endometrium, myometrium, and the perimetrium. Again, highly vascular, making up the structure of the uterus. The vagina, as it says here, is fibromuscular tube that conveys the uterine secretions, receives penis during intercourse, and obviously part of the reproductive tract. Down near the cervix, along the fornices, the cervix being the opening, we mentioned the other night, normally is plugged with mucus as a barrier and protection. But on occasion, every cycle, that mucus becomes very watery, and the sperm are able to make their way through the cervix and travel towards uterine tubes. As we look at external genitalia for female, we make a parallel last week to the male reproductive anatomy. We see here the labia major, much like the scrotum, used for protection regulation, along with the labia minor. The clitoris contains obviously the sensitive tissues for arousal, much like the pubis of the male penis. And the vestibular glands, very much similar to the male bulbourethral glands. Those produce that fluid for intercourse. Although the male reproductive anatomy, like we mentioned earlier last week, contains two additional structures, the seminal vesicles, which produce that neutralizing fluid for the metabolic wastes of the sperm, and the prostate gland produces the neutralizing fluid for the vagina. Vagina is very acidic. We know that definitely inhibits reproduction and growth of other organisms, and the sperm is actually dealt with by the female body as foreign tissue. So the sperm and the semen and the neutralizing fluid that's contained definitely aids in fertilization. A little more detail on some of the external genitalia, covered with adipose tissue and skin for the labia major. Again, encloses and protects other important reproductive organs. Elevated over the symphysis pubis, part of the right and left coxal bones. Labia minor, again, provides opening for the vestibular glands for reproduction, opening of the vestibule leading to the vagina. In addition, the vestibule contains much of the tissue for the urethral openings, which is separate from the vestibule and the opening of the vaginal cavity. We mentioned for male reproduction, that's actually a shared pathway, both the urethra and reproductive tract for semen. So a little bit difference there. And another favorite summary slide. Moving on to hormonal control of reproductive functions, making some parallels with male reproduction as well. We start with the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus releases a tropic hormone, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, that affects the anterior pituitary. And much like male reproduction, we see the production of FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, and this time LH. The male counterpart to that would be the ISCH, interstitial cell hormone. These gonadotropins enter the bloodstream, and the target cells for these particular gonadotropins are the ovaries. Stimulation of the ovaries will produce the female androgen, estrogen, and the estrogen has multiple effects, obviously increasing breast development, vascularization of the skin, but most importantly in reproduction, stimulates the endometrium in the uterus to thicken. And that estrogen will continue after fertilization. Early in the reproductive cycle, the levels of estrogen and progesterone, another androgen, continue to thicken and increase in the lining of the uterus. That function is eventually taken over from the ovaries to the placenta itself. The placenta will continue to promote the development of the myometrium, endometrium tissues to promote growth and development of the offspring. Seeing a little bit of negative feedback play a role here. Estrogens inhibit oversecretion of gonadotropins, and this again occurs through most of the reproductive cycle. Another summary table for secondary sex characteristics and the effect of that gonadotropin-releasing hormone. So we note that estrogens are very powerful hormones, develop breast tissue, ductal systems of the mammary glands for delivery. During lactation, increased adipose tissue in breasts, increased vascularization of skin. We mentioned on the previous slide the source of estrogen primarily from the ovaries early in reproductive process, and also adipose tissue. But will be taken over eventually as later development occurs by the placenta. We also note that at puberty androgens cause hair and other changes in female secondary sex characteristics. Now I want to take you through this particular text box, and you can see on the left side it says, why does estrogen and progesterone inhibit secretions from the anterior pituitary gland? Well, if we look at the top, under number 1, we'll just follow this information chart here. Anterior pituitary releases FSH and LH, and we know that's for the preparation of the ovary and the release of the secondary oocyte due to concentrations of this luteinizing hormone here. FSH will also stimulate the maturation of that follicle, going from the primordial stage ultimately to that mature secondary oocyte. Along the way, granulosa cells of the follicle secrete estrogens, which cause the appearance of the female secondary sex characteristics. And at some point, typically day 14, the anterior pituitary releases a surge of LH, which we know stimulates ovulation, the release of that secondary oocyte. The cells that remain, the follicular and thecal cells, basically form what's called the corpus luteum. This structure that remains in the ovary continues to secrete estrogens and progesterone. In addition, if we look here on step C, estrogens and progesterone inhibit secretion of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary gland. If we did not have that level of inhibition during that cycle, increasing levels of FSH and LH promote the release of another oocyte, secondary oocyte. Now this would in turn produce another viable egg for fertilization, and if sperm is present, we could have the situation where one secondary oocyte is fertilized, traveling down the reproductive tract and causing implantation, followed immediately by another oocyte. Typically, female reproduction is designed for one embryo at a time, so this prevents basically multiple pregnancies. If we pick up from number 6 here, the secondary oocyte is not fertilized, the corpus luteum will continue to degenerate, no longer secreting the estrogens and progesterone, and we would see the uterine lining disintegrate, producing basically the process of menstruation. Through this diagram, I like the way that these diagrams follow. You can see at the top here, we have graphing over time levels of LH and FSH. We see changes that are occurring in the follicle, along with, at the bottom here, the changes in the uterine lining. And we see this line here on day 14 during ovulation. There's quite a spike in luteinizing hormone LH here, which causes a major increase here on day 14, and you can see ovulation taking place here. Now, assuming that there is a viable sperm present after fertilization, we would see a significant change occur here with continued production of estrogen and progesterone, along with continued growth and development of the endometrial lining. Because of the effects in aging, we do see changes, metabolic changes, to both males and females. Ovaries no longer producing the level of estrogen and progesterone. We know this has sort of far-reaching effects for many female secondary sex characteristics, hot flashes, fatigue, the bone density decreasing, and a variety of other effects. Hormone therapy may prevent the effects, but it is gradual and progressive over time. During early development, we also see changes within the mammary glands due to that change in estrogen level. Mammary tissue contains structures called alveolar glands. Alveolar glands produce initially what's referred to as colostrum, basically a certain level of protein. Very interesting mix of proteins, if you remember our discussion about diabetes a few weeks ago, in addition to galactose. Let's see. We remember from the endocrine system, prolactin is a hormone that will stimulate the alveolar glands as a target cell, producing lactation effects, whereas oxytocin really affects the lactiferous ducts and promotes the movement of the milk product. A few interesting pieces of information on birth control, some using chemical, some are more mechanical barriers, and some are more inhibitive types of devices using oral contraceptives. Intrauterine devices are surgery. We see with some surgical methods for the vasectomy, the vas deferens or ductus deferens are cut and ligated. They're basically reflected back on themselves. Same process for what they refer to as tubal ligation with the uterine tubes. And of course, we finish with a wonderful discussion of some STDs. You can read and take a look at some of these wonderful gifts from others: herpes, warts, AIDS, and a variety of other things. So So that will be it for the female reproductive system. Take a look at the questions on the Chapter 22 worksheet. And like I mentioned in the email before, we'll be having a Chapter 22 quiz. So as soon as you're finished with that work, submit the worksheet, take the quiz, and we will see you next week. Have a great night.